Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura. I'm a social worker here in New York, and today we are joined by Dan Maigler, a mental health advisor of Paws for Patrick. Thanks, Dan, for coming on today.
I'm super excited to be here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Today, we're going to get into some really interesting stuff about emotional support animals and like therapists writing letters for emotional support animals. I think a lot of stuff that we hear about, but we've never really like taught how to do it or like know what's really going on there. So I'm really excited to get your insight today. Um, as we get started, do you just want to start and kind of give an overview of your own professional journey and what you're currently doing?
Sure. I've been at this for a while, so mine's a little longer than some people. I started out thinking I wanted to get into politics, but I worked on campaigns when I was in college and I thought it was just gross. It was all just about who was donating and giving more money to who. So I
Hmm.
worked for a nonprofit called the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, and I needed a job after I graduated. And so I got a list of organizations that they had worked with, and I went one by one through this 1,000 list book, and I got to this place called the Center for Violence Interruption, and I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. So I applied there and got hired to teach violence prevention programming in Chicago public schools for kids who've been kicked out of Chicago public schools. And I just fell
Awesome.
in love with direct service. So I went
Hmm.
from there to a home for abused and neglected kids to working at a Catholic school in the city to at a hospital. And I've been a school social worker and for over 20 years, and I've had my LCSW for about 20 years.
Awesome. Wow, you've done so much. Yeah, that's such a social work journey too.
Yeah,
I feel
right.
like we kind of just fall into a did a million different things. That's awesome. Okay. Can you tell us too about, so you're with this nonprofit now, Paws for Patrick. You're the mental health advisor. Can you tell us a bit about Paws for Patrick and kind of what they do?
Yeah. So, in my role as a school social worker, I got to work with a boy named Patrick Romer. And unfortunately, in May of 2020, Patrick died by suicide.
Mm,
And his time, I worked with him for his freshman through his senior year, and I was very close to the family and connected to them. And one of the things that had always really been an incredible help to him was his dog, Cece. When he couldn't speak in my office, when he was just shaking and so filled with anxiety that he couldn't even move, he would just want to go home and be with her. Because if he could just hold Cece, he knew he was going to be okay. Unfortunately, the first day of his senior year, Cece, who was only 6 years old, died suddenly of an unexpected illness. And he never really fully recovered from that. His family tried getting another dog, tried doing other things, but it was not the same. So after he passed away, his family knew, okay, we've got to do something to help other people. And it's got to be about mental health and it has to involve animals. So they formed Paws for
mm,
Patrick and in August of 2020, and I've been on the board since its inception. And what we do is we try to connect young people, 30 and younger, with emotional health issues to emotional support animals. So if a person needs an emotional support animal letter, if they go on our website, pawsforpatrick.org, they can get connected to a therapist who will write a ESA letter and Paws for Patrick will pay for it. Or if they want to adopt an animal from a shelter, Paws for Patrick will reimburse them for their adoption fees. So if they adopt an animal from a shelter. And we've helped people in
awesome.
all 50 states now. So it's been a pretty cool experience to be involved with. And it's really helped me to heal from the loss of Patrick.
Mm, absolutely. It is a unique position to be in to like have been working with this young person and obviously go through a loss like that is very difficult, but you can like still be a part of the kind of legacy that's there. Wow. And I think this is something, I mean, at least in my own personal experience as a therapist, I have always heard about emotional support animals and like I've had many clients request like, oh, can you write this letter for me to do XYZ? And I'm like, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't actually know what the heck I'm doing. And I was like, I don't really know what this is or like who I'm supposed to give this to or what like how what am I supposed to be saying right now? And so could you also just like explain to the listeners what exactly an ESA letter is and what is important about it?
Yeah. So people have a lot of misconceptions. They think they have to have their animal registered somewhere. And an
Okay.
emotional support animal letter is not for the animal, it's for the person. So we almost think
Mm,
about it as having like if you have a prescription for something, it's not about the pill bottle. It's about you having this prescription. You can take it wherever you need to go. So in a
true.
lot of apartment buildings or college dorms, they won't let you have an animal or they might charge you a pet deposit or pet fees. So
Hmm.
if you have an emotional disability, however, according to FHA, the Fair Housing Act, you cannot be charged a pet fee or a pet deposit. So if this animal is helping you cope in some way with a disability that you have. Now, when we use the term disability, it's not like when we think of Social Security disability, like you can't work or anything else like that. It just
Right.
means that you have a mental health condition that, its frequency, intensity, or duration of your symptoms are benefited by having an animal near you. And it doesn't have to be a dog or a cat. It could be a chinchilla or a kangaroo or a tarantula. It's whatever it means to you. Just being
Hmm.
around that, though, helps you out. So again, a major misconception people have, especially in writing the letters, is sometimes they will say that they need to have this animal because not having the animal will impair one or more major life functions. Well, I don't know, breathing, sleeping, doing all the things that anxiety can prevent us from doing, eating,
Hmm.
wanting to interact with people. Are those major life functions? Yeah. So if being
Hmm.
around your animal helps you to do that, then you should qualify. And the way the law is written, it's not to be like a high barrier. Most disorders, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, they would automatically qualify. So if you're working with a client and you believe in your clinical judgment that they have one of those disorders, then err on the side of going ahead and saying yes to that. Because when we
Hmm.
think about access to animals, I think about it as like access to music. We know
Hmm.
music really helps a lot of people. We should not have barriers to music. But we can understand that if people are walking around with a boombox on their shoulder and blasting out other people's eardrums, that's a problem. And similarly, if you're
Hmm.
working with a client, you want to help them to realize you need to be a respectful neighbor. You need to be good about this. But if having access to that animal helps you, why shouldn't you have that? And there
Hmm.
is, as social workers, we need to think about the fact that we'd ask who wouldn't have access to this? Well, it's really a financial thing. For people
Hmm.
who I live in a house. Nobody's asking me. I don't need a letter or anything like that to have my animal here. It's only people who
Right.
are renting or who are in dorms who don't have that power. I've written
Hmm.
animal letters for people who are in homeless shelters and they could get housing, but they won't leave the homeless shelter because they want to be with their animal. And
Yeah.
so again, when we are saying no to people, or when we're saying, oh, well, I need to see you for this number of sessions or whatnot, we're really preventing people from living the way they want to live. And so our belief in people's self-efficacy. So again, the letter is just our certification that this person has a disability. And so it's up to the client what they do with it. Typically, they're going to need it for their landlord or they might need it for their dorm. But ESAs really only apply to where you live. So you'll hear a lot of people complaining about, oh my gosh, I was in Target the other day and somebody had their ESA in their cart. Well,
Hmm.
technically, they don't have the legal right to do that. ESAs really only refer to your dwelling. Now, it does vary a little bit state by state. In some states like California, you might have some rights to bring it into the workplace. But for the most
Hmm.
part, the only animals that have the right to be anywhere, have open access, are service animals. So we think of seeing eye dogs or things like that. Now, some
Hmm.
people do have psychiatric service dogs, but those are really rare. A psychiatric or service dog means that this animal has been specifically trained to help remediate a symptom. So for people with epilepsy, they might alert the person by like licking their hand or whatnot, or if they're diabetic, if their sugar's getting off. But
Right.
those dogs take about $12 to $15,000 to train, and it's a really big deal. So we shouldn't conflate, and people do. They misunderstand what's an emotional support animal, what's a service animal, and what's a therapy dog. So I don't know if you have more questions about any of that, but yeah.
Oh, I think that's so helpful because that cleared up some things for me because I hear a lot of people, I mean, almost use the terms interchangeably.
Hmm.
I also had no idea that emotional support animals was mostly just about like your home
Hmm.
and like nowhere else. Because I think also you hear almost like these horror stories, I guess, of just like people getting into trouble or like they're bringing their animal somewhere that they're not allowed to, and so they use this reason of like, but it's my emotional support animal. I have a right to do
Hmm.
this X, Y, Z. And so this is helpful to know kind of like what the limits are and what actually is what.
Right.
So,
Just because someone went on Amazon and bought a vest for their dog does not mean they have the right to bring it to certain places. And
all
and
right.
and I think that's what there's a lot of people who are online who are really love animals and love emotional support animals, but they're a little bit crabby and they hate. There's a lot of pay services like Petable or CertaPet online where a person can pay up to $150 to a therapist to get a letter, and you'll hear claims that those aren't legitimate. And the answer is actually they are totally legitimate, just like you might pay an eye doctor to get an eye exam. And they'll say, well, if you haven't met with the person 3 times, then it's not legitimate. It's like, how many times do you need to meet with the eye doctor? They just need to meet with
Mhm.
them enough to know if there's actually a disorder there and if they can give a
Right.
prescription. When I used to work, I actually also worked in an ER. And so when I used to work in the ER, like I would have to decide within a half an hour if a person could go home or if they had to be hospitalized. So are you telling me I can't determine in a half an hour or 45 minutes if a person has enough depression or anxiety that they might benefit from an animal? So I think there's a lot
Mm,
of people who are trying to be gatekeepers right now, and their
mm,
intent is to make sure we don't lose those legal rights because they really care so much about it. But we really want to
mm,
be careful that we're not being too much of gatekeepers. So if a person is interested in working for CertaPet or Petable or one of those many agencies, they have to do a clinical interview with a person who hops on, and
mm.
they're putting their clinical license at jeopardy if they were certifying people who do not meet criteria. And so
Right.
it's really about, what does that clinician feel is meeting the criteria to know. So what we're certifying in the letter, what has to go into it is it has to be on your stationery, has to have the date of the interview
Okay.
has happened, and it has to
Hmm.
say that you know about this person's history. And then in your professional judgment, this person does have a disability that may be remediated by having an animal, and that they need
Hmm.
access to this animal in their dwelling to remove some of those symptoms. You do not have to say what the disorder is. That is not, we want to protect people's health information. And so sometimes
Right.
the less we put in the letter, the better, because they're giving this to their landlord. And we want to imagine that landlords are going to keep their health
Mm,
information safe. But let's err, err on the side of caution and protecting people's
definitely.
information. So,
Hmm.
and I have had the experience that about 70% of, I've written over 150 letters, and many apartment complexes will ask me to fill out, in addition to the letter, they may ask for other forms to be filled out. And the forms are typically asking for information that it is not truly legal, according to HUD and FHA, to request, but they do it anyway.
Right.
And then it's between
Mm,
me and the client of, well, how much of this extra information do you want me to share? And most people just say, go ahead and share it because whatever. And they're just trying to intimidate therapists and people from jumping through the hoops, because
right.
cat pee smells really bad and you don't want to rent out an apartment with, and so they're saying, okay, we want to
Sure.
make this a pain for people to get these emotional support animal letters and have their animal in their home,
Mm,
just because for the property owner, that's what they care about. They care about their real estate values. But
mm.
we need to be advocate for our clients and make sure that they have access to the things that they need and they're not paying extra money, which could keep them from having one of the cheapest and most cost-effective mental health supports that's out there.
Mhm.
Dr. Janet Oy-Gerlach of the University of Toledo has done she's one of the pioneers doing research on the effectiveness of this. And you could say, well, why do emotional support animals help? And
Right.
what we can see is that spending time with our animals, stroking their fur can reduce our anxiety, lower our heart rate.
Mhm.
And they feel that they can even decrease cortisol, that stress hormone, and
Oh, wow.
increase the oxytocin release for people, just making eye contact with your pet. One of the
Mm.
really interesting findings of her research is that cats are actually slightly more effective than dogs in reducing symptoms of depression. So I thought that was really, I was like,
Interesting.
wow.
That is so interesting. It's funny too, because I just think about so many therapy sessions I have, because I do all telehealth,
Hmm.
and constantly my clients' pets are like joining the call, or I have a client who's just like petting their cat as we're talking, and I've even recommended, not even like the official like emotional support animal, but I've recommended to people like, I think you could benefit from a pet or
Hmm.
something like to bring you some comfort, and it's been really powerful in that way. And obviously these letters are in place to help people where there are those barriers that are there. And I think as therapists, in my background in social work as well, is to like help people advocate in that way. And that's, it sounds like this is kind of an advocacy for them, as being able to show up and be like, no, the support would be valuable to you.
When there's so many people who talk about how, truly that getting out of bed in the morning is so hard with depression, with anxiety,
Hmm.
but having their animal that they know they need to get up and feed and take care of or take for a walk. You might hear my dog Mariska, my 3-tooth Patterdale Terrier, licking her paws in the background. I do therapy in private practice as well. And this is my little office closet where I do them. And I have a mental health podcast called Not Allowed to Die, where, we talk about the mental health challenges that I'm seeing in my practice. But so again, when I'm walking around the neighborhood with Mariska, I know the neighbors' dogs' names better than I know the neighbors' names. And it just, for social anxiety, for so many other things,
Yeah.
it helps us to feel like we're not just a leaf blown in the wind, that we are the caregiver for
Mhm.
someone. And for our clients who felt like they're just always a burden, having an animal flips things and reverses it. And, we'll hear people tell stories of I was ready to go and die by suicide, but thinking about my animal and who would take care of my animal gave me another day, caused me to really think about that and slowed me down. So again, it's amazing the impact they can have. That being said, ethically, when we're thinking about it, we don't want to encourage people who are not animal people to
This
get
is
an emotional
true.
support animal.
Yes, you were right.
So because we really always want to be thinking about, are we encouraging a sustainable pairing? Because it is a huge feeling of failure for a client if they have an animal and then it has to be rehomed because it can't stay with them. So at Paws for Patrick, when we're talking to people about what kind of animal might work for them, we never say no to people. We might say not yet. While you're in the dorms, a St. Bernard or a pony might not be the right emotional support animal for you. Maybe we should be thinking more about a cat or a hamster. I did an emotional support animal letter for a turtle. And you could say, well, why would they need that? Well, for dorms, a lot of times they're saying no animals in here unless you have that letter, unless you can prove that you've got this disability. So as we go back, we have to all we're saying is that this person has the disability, that they may benefit, and that's really all a lot of therapists are erroneously worried about liability. They're like, well, what if something happens? And if I encourage a client to go get exercise and they fall off the treadmill, I am not liable for that. In the same way, if I write a letter and someone's emotional support peacock pecks someone else in the face, I am not liable for that either. So again, I'm just saying they have the disability. What happens with that animal after is between, the client and the rest of their life. If the client's animal does damage the property, they're going to be liable for that damage. They have to take care of things. So again, when we're thinking about what is a pairing, is it going to be sustainable? And we do have to think about, for like Patrick, who lost his animal, if this emotional support animal does become a major support for you, unless it's a parrot or a Galapagos tortoise, you're going to outlive it. And what are you going to do when you lose that support? So we have to be thinking about that from the time that the person gets the animal. All right, how are we going to make this pairing sustainable and realistic for you? And can you afford its food? Can you afford these other things? If not, are there some other agencies that you can reach out to? There's for even homeless clients, there's places like the Street Dog Coalition where they may help their animals to get vet care. So there are resources out there, but we want to be connecting people to those resources before they bring the animal in. And if they already do have the animal, what can we do to help make sure there's for women who are experiencing or people experiencing intimate partner violence, there's the Purple Leash Project, which will help people to have someone to help care for their animal if they go into a shelter because so many people are caught in emotionally unsafe relationships because they worry about what will happen to their animal. So these are things as therapists we need to be thinking about and talking about, but not acting as a barrier and stopping people from getting those letters and having those unions that are so great.
You mentioned so many good things that I'm realizing make a lot of sense, and I just don't think I've thought about before. Just like the actual practicality and like, okay, now you have this animal, which is awesome and emotionally supportive, but you still have to take care of it. It's still a responsibility. It's still like we want to address those other things that are there too. Wow. How important.
Well, and another thing that, a lot of clients will ask me or they'll say is, okay, now I got this emotional support animal and I want to get it trained to be a service animal and a therapy dog. And
interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And what I'll say to them is you can do one or the other, but you can't do both. So a therapy dog is an animal that a person may have their own pet and they may want to take it to hospitals or to nursing homes and places like that. So if you have a dog or, they have therapy horses, some other animals that can be trained, that's highly non-reactive, that does really well with interacting with people, then you can go to a trainer and get it trained. There's a place called Alliance for Therapy Dogs where people are interested. They can find a place local to them where they might be able to find trainers. And then Alliance for Therapy Dogs will put them through a little sort of test to see how non-reactive they are. And then they will certify them. And then you can get insurance through Alliance for Therapy Dogs, because if God forbid something would happen and you have your animal out there, many places won't let you bring your therapy dog in unless it's insured. So if it did bite or something else like that. So, but there is no specific training that they must complete. But a lot of dog trainers will do things like canine good citizenship training, and usually it takes about 6 months or more, and anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000 to get your dog trained to be a therapy dog. They can usually only work every other day and about an hour in that setting because it is stressful and exhausting for animals to go do that work. And then there's another kind of therapy dog called a facility dog, which is if people at like a hospital or whatnot, a courthouse, anywhere, where the dog lives there or spends most of its working time there, might go home with someone, and they can do a lot more work if they're a facility animal because they're more used to that environment. But the idea is they
Right.
have to be ready to interact with lots of people and not react to other dogs or other things. Whereas that
Mm.
service animal we talked about earlier, they are trained to pay attention really only to the person who's handling them. And when they're working, no one else is supposed to touch them. No one else is supposed to interact with them. So the training for a service animal is to focus on the one person, whereas the training for the therapy dog is to be able to focus out. So again, if a person has an ESA and they want to use it for that, they can go one direction or the other, but probably not both. And most ESAs are, my dog would not be a fit for anything like that. They really have to have the right temperament to go forward and do
Yeah.
those other things.
Okay. So and then, I mean, whether someone like wants to then, okay, let's make this my ESA a therapy dog or something,
Mm-hmm.
even though that dog would then be trained to like be supportive of other people, it's still an emotional support to that individual person.
That's right. So your emotional support animal, as I said, it can be a goldfish. It doesn't have to do
Right.
anything. An emotional support animal doesn't need any training. It's just how you feel when you're
Mm.
around it. So that's what would you do with that?
I'm wondering, we'll get into like ethics and stuff like that for therapists and things, but are there any, do you, off the top of your head, this might be a hard question, but like what are the laws and regulations around ESAs and therapy dogs and service dogs? Like, I guess it would depend on your state and everything, but like you can only take them certain places and I don't I don't know.
Yeah. So in general, though, we can assume that while state law differs in every single state, it pretty much
Hmm.
you can pretty well depend that service animals are going to be allowed almost everywhere, and
Okay.
that ESAs in general are pretty much only covering the home. A request, though, that I'll get from a lot of people is, what about hotels? Can I bring my ESA to a hotel? And the answer is legally, probably not. But most hotels do have, because they have to be ready to accommodate service animals, they usually do have a room or two that is prepared to have animals and animal fur and things like that in it. So if you call
Oh.
ahead and you explain your situation, you say, I have an emotional support animal and I can, send you a letter. But usually they would just charge you the same way. Like right now, airlines, they used to say you could bring emotional support animals on without an extra fee. And that's when I think we saw a
Mm.
lot of people accusing them of, sort of working the system. Whereas
Right.
now they don't treat emotional support animals any differently than they do any pet. So anyone can bring their pet on board a plane if they pay an added fee. They just need to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that they're responsible for the behavior of their pet or their emotional support animal. Whereas those service animals can be allowed pretty much anywhere.
Mm.
Places like Ohio have some laws which kind of really try to intimidate therapists from writing letters. They'll say, are you an expert in emotional support animals? And the reality is there's no coursework to become an expert in emotional support
Right.
animals. So, if you're listening to this and you're practicing in the state of Ohio, after listening to this or watching a couple YouTube videos, you're probably enough. I would Google search Dr. Janet Oy-Gerlach. There's a lot of free trainings out there, but after a half an hour training, then you are expert enough to feel, as long as you're feeling it's within your ethical scope and practice. If you feel
Mm.
like it's not and you don't feel comfortable writing those letters, refer your clients like you would with anything else to one of those other organizations that can help them out. But I don't
Mm.
think therapists should not be intimidated to write these letters. There's nobody better to
Yeah.
write the letter than someone who knows that client well. If I've been working with a client for a couple months, I can literally write an ESA letter in under 10 minutes. And you can find
Mm.
templates online. You pretty much just have to plug in their name and onto your letterhead
Hmm.
and put your signature. As long as you're speaking the truth, that's really what matters.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful because I've been in that position where I'm just like, am I even qualified to do this? Because I think
Mhm.
there are also like some just like tiny rules. I don't know if we're ever taught in the profession of like, oh, well, you can't technically diagnose these specific things. You need to like refer that to a psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm like, is this one of those things? Do I need to refer to someone else? And so it is helpful there. I do wonder, because you and I are both licensed clinical social workers.
Mhm.
Do you have to be a clinical social worker, a therapist? Does it matter like what degree you hold or like your title in that way?
According to HUD and FHA, the laws, it's pretty much any clinically licensed person. So
Okay.
even technically, like a medical professional, like a doctor, could write one of these letters, but I think most of them would say that's out of the scope of my practice. But if
Mm,
you carry a clinical license, then it doesn't. If you're a licensed marriage and family therapist, if you're licensed anything, then your letter would stand up as being legal.
good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. 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 Okay. So I think we've also established like one of the biggest challenges I think I've seen, at least for myself and from other therapists, is are we even allowed to do this? And
hmm
like what does that even look like? What are some of the other challenges you've seen that you've come across, other clinicians, even just formulating a letter or knowing how to go about it?
Again, one is just so can I? If a person has multiple animals? Are they all considered emotional support animals?
Mm,
And so some people will say, well, they want to have 9 cats in this apartment, and so technically, we generally would say it's only probably the one animal that counts as the emotional support animal, unless
right.
the different animals are they have a specific function for different aspects or symptoms of disabilities. So I did have a
Mm,
woman who had 6 different cats, and she could articulate the nexus between which symptoms those different kind of cats helped with which aspect of her disability. So certain
wow.
cats were more playful and they helped her get up in the morning. And certain cats were
Hmm.
much more chill and relaxing. So when she was having an anxiety attack, stroking them did something different. So again, that's going back to our clinical judgment and saying, is there truly a nexus between the disability and their need to have this animal? And if the answer is yes, then ethically we can justify why they need to have all these different animals. But if they just want
Hmm.
to avoid the pet fee, pet deposit, then perhaps not. Again,
Hmm.
coming back to our ethics of saying, is it really ethical and does it make sense for the person, our pet deposits and pet fees, are those ethical? No, the other thing we need to know is that
It's
FHA and
true.
HUD don't cover, like, if let's say a person lives in just a 2 flat building, which is
Hmm.
it's owner occupied, they are not technically covered by HUD and FHA. But our experience has been if we talk to the owner and we just explain this is how the animal helps, then a lot of
Hmm.
times they may say, okay, we can waive the pet fee. So just communicating with people and having a good open
Yeah.
dialogue instead of saying, I have the right to this and insisting to them more of an
Mm,
explanation. Here's why having an animal helps. Another question that pops up a lot is, what about breeds? Like, can I have a pit bull? Can I have a Rottweiler? And the
mm,
answer is you can have an elephant, you can have a rhinoceros, any kind of animal that is. But if there are laws in your town that say our town says no Rottweilers in this whole town, no pit bulls. If you are living in an overall housing complex that says that those,
mm,
so if there's overarching town related rules, this would not supersede that.
mhm. Okay, good to know. I do wonder, I mean, if an emotional support animal, let's say like I'm a therapist meeting with this person and they're dealing with maybe something that's more short term, and
Mm-hmm.
so their symptoms and everything have resolved, like with treatment and everything, would that animal still be like an emotional support animal at that point, or
I
like does
mean,
it
so
phase out, or?
if they truly no longer had the disability, then no, it wouldn't. And so a lot of apartment complexes will say they'll want it. I'll have people reach back out to me annually and say they want this updated.
Gotcha.
But
Mm,
the vast majority of like, unfortunately, anxiety doesn't have an expiration date. Depression doesn't have an
it's
expiration
true.
date. And
Yeah.
so if it was, say, adjustment disorder with like depressed or anxious mood, and it was because of, a life event that was very time limited, then it might not still qualify in your own clinical judgment. But to
Right.
me, if the person has, even if they've been in full or partial remission of their symptoms for 12 years. But if we think not having access to that animal might make it more likely that they would revert
Hmm.
back to anxiety, revert back to depression, then we're on sound clinical footing by saying, no, this person still
Hmm.
qualifies, even though they haven't had an anxiety attack in 10 years.
Mm. Yeah. I love it's very empowering for clinicians to kind of be like, you know your clients, you know the people that you're working with, like you
Mm-hmm.
can trust your judgment and what you feel is like a good course of action, so long as your client is also like on board with that. That's very, very interesting.
Well, and then we would, again, because what are they really getting other than the chance to live what we should all have is the chance to live with animals?
Right.
And if that's really
Mm-hmm.
helping them, again, just like living with music, why shouldn't they have that as long as they are being a good neighbor and good citizen?
Mm-hmm.
Another challenging ethical dilemma that one of our clinicians, I was helping someone out with, is this
Mm-hmm.
young woman, a 13-year-old girl, was released from the hospital and she wanted to get an emotional support animal. And she reached out to Paws for Patrick. And um, And talking to the family, another person who was helping them out said they had a previous history of having a cat and a dog, but the city came and took the dog away because it was pooping in the yard and they weren't picking up the poop enough. And then their cat got pretty old, so they just let it go out to die on its own. And so, gosh, this doesn't
Oh,
sound like a really good steward of an animal. And so
right.
as clinicians, we're never going to put an animal in harm's way. If we don't
Mm,
people feel like these people can really be good caretakers for an animal, that's not an ethically sound thing to do because we care about our clients, but not at the expense of animals. So what we said to
mm,
this person is like, listen, we're going to need to have more communication with the therapist that you're currently working with, because many therapists, unfortunately, by the agency they work for, are not allowed to write emotional support animal letters. So I would say about,
right.
again, at least 60 to 80% of the letters I write are for people who are already working with a different therapist. But if they're at a campus
Mm,
counseling center, the university won't let them write the letter or whatnot. So they're under care from someone else. But in this case, we said, we'll need some ongoing contact to make sure this environment is stable enough. And can you give us some documentation of why your other dog was taken away? And
mm-hmm,
so without that, again, we wouldn't say no, but we say not yet. We need a little more. And that family just didn't follow up. But
mm,
again, we don't want to be, the barriers, but we do want to make sure the animals are going to be safe.
okay. So that's interesting. So I guess there could be situations then where maybe originally a therapist like provides an ESA letter,
Mm-hmm.
but with more information, they feel like they need to revoke that letter or kind of say like maybe this isn't right, or like is that if they feel like maybe there's safety issues or issues with that person taking care of that pet, or like how would that work?
I would say once you've given the letter, you kind of really don't have much power to revoke it. It's
Fair.
their letter to kind of do with what they want.
Mm,
All you've said is that when they were with me, I verified they had a disability. That being said,
right.
if we feel like they're not going to be safe for the animal or for themselves, then we might say, I don't feel comfortable ethically writing a new letter for you. And so, in that case,
Right. Mm, yeah. Which I'm also thinking it's not happening a lot of the time.
no,
Most
that's
of the
not the vast
time,
majority.
pets
Yeah.
are a great thing and people are loving them and taking care of them, and it's wonderful. And a win-win
Yes.
for everyone. Good. Okay. This has been, I'm just blown away because this really has been incredibly helpful. I'm thinking I just feel a little bit more equipped to actually write an ESA letter should a client need one, or even having that conversation with someone. And I'm like, hey, this is
Yeah.
a possibility here. Like, what are we feeling? So that's
Well,
very
that's what
cool.
at Paws for Patrick, we feel like we're doing a few things we're helping people to get that access. So again, if anybody's listening to this and they have a client, and even if their client is, so let's say their client is 52, our focus is on young people, but if they have children of their own, so we will work with parents, or people who are 30 and younger. So if mom has depression, then that's affecting those young people. So
Mm-hmm.
and so if you think your client could benefit, but they would need some help with an adoption fee, please encourage them to go to Paws for
Mm-hmm.
Patrick for help getting that. If they need that emotional support, animal letter, if they just need, some ideas, help and advice. But we also want to encourage therapists to be more active in giving these letters. And so that's my role, is to try to be that ambassador, to say, you can do this. This is a good thing for you to do, and your clients and will benefit from it.
That's awesome. I really love that. With that, I mean, is there any one, I guess maybe you kind of just said it then, but like any other one particular takeaway for the therapists and social workers listening as we kind of talk about emotional support animals?
Just again, don't be a gatekeeper. Be
Mm,
empowering of your clients, and the things, understand that they know what often many people already have an animal and now they just need the documentation. But our
mm-hmm.
job is not, and that's what I love about being a social worker. No offense to the psychologists out there, everyone else, but we have that strengths-based
Mm-hmm.
belief. We believe in our clients, and now our job is just to help to connect them to resources. So
Mm,
they can make these decisions, and the best therapist in the world is not going to be there for you at 3 a.m. But your cat, your
mm-hmm.
dog, your bird, they can be, and they can be transformative
Awesome.
to your life. So let's help people to get connected to animals, because we know that it reduces their hypertension, the chances of getting, heart disease, diabetes, all kinds of things. We can really help people
Mm-hmm.
in a variety of ways. And it also helps to normalize mental health challenges, because when people talk about their emotional support animal, everyone lights up. Most of the areas where we're talking about mental health, there's a bit of a stigma. But what I love about this idea of talking about the intersection between animals and mental health, it helps everyone to say, oh yeah, I had a dog, I had a cat, and when I went through some tough times, they were really there for me.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's so true. That's so true. Even in, yeah, in so many therapy sessions, I mean, we're talking about pets and just as much as we are like they are loved ones and things that
Hmm.
we care about. And it's so valuable. Wow. Well, Dan, this has been really, really helpful, and I really appreciate you coming on to talk today. Where can the listeners continue to like keep up with you and Pause for Patrick?
Yeah, so for Paws for Patrick, they can go to pawsforpatrick.org. For me, you can follow, they listen to my podcast, Not Allowed to Die, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. When I have guests on, I will sometimes put them out on YouTube as well. But mostly it's just me talking about if I've seen a few dilemmas that week in my practice, or that, I say, oh, the themes come up about abandonment this week. What are my thoughts on
Mm,
that? And just from a
hmm.
therapist's lens of, I was doing some clinical supervision for some people that they were dealing with. Do I call DCFS or not? And so how I might go through that. So
Ooh,
those are the kind of things I'll talk about on my podcast. And
that's
I'm
awesome.
starting a group on Forum for parents who are they have adult over 18 children who they're still supporting who have mental health or substance abuse challenges. So if so
Mm,
people want to work with me, that would be a way. But mostly it's just through the podcast and go to Pause for Patrick.
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Maybe we'll have you on again in the future. I'm really
That'd be
excited
great.
about this episode, and I think it's been really insightful. For those listening, feel free to like, share, listen to the podcast, send it to a fellow social worker, and we will see you next time. Thank you.